Doing excellent astrology from a predictive level is basically a matter of confluence. In order to feel confident predicting something as an astrologer, you really want to see several different factors pointing at the same thing. The predictions that tend to fall through the most are those predictions when an astrologer perhaps just sees one factor that's pointing towards something. That's not a strong indication. You really need to see several things that are saying the same thing. One of the best ways to do this is through working with Vimshottari Dasha and mutual agenda of the planets. Now let's talk about that concept of mutual agenda of the planets. What is that specifically? Well, that's when you have the dasha or first level planetary period and the antardasha and second level planetary period and the prachantardasha or third level planetary period. And if you have a good rectified birth time, even further down. But we're going to stop at 3 levels. That's when you have all 3 of those pointing at the same thing. They all have the same indications for something. And they all have the strength to create it. That's good mutual planetary agenda. And there are many different ways that astrologers might determine this. The best way that I have found to determine it relates to something called the Baladi Avastas and the Jagradati Avastas, which are in chapter 45 of Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. So starting this Sunday, the 7th of October, I'm going to be teaching a 15-class webinar series on how to work with this particular technique in order to do good, very good, I should say, concrete prediction using Vimshottari Dasha. What is concrete prediction? Predicting concrete events, predicting actual events. Okay, so this course is $329 for a 15-week webinar course. And over the course, or the duration of this course, I should say, we're going to be learning techniques involving the Avastas, how to work with mutual planetary agenda, how to put it all together using Vimshottari Dasha in order to do excellent and accurate prediction. If you're interested in registering for this course, you can do so through the link above. And I'm going to show you a particular example today involving Jimi Hendrix's chart. And what we're going to be taking a look at is the event that was really kind of the big break for Jimi Hendrix, which happened towards the end of September in 1966 when he was discovered by Chas Chandler, who was then used to be a member of the Animals, and he was looking to produce other musicians, and he discovered Hendrix and flew him to London, which was really the big break for Hendrix. And so we're going to go into the astrological software, and I'm going to give you a sneak peek at some of these techniques. I know that rhymes. Poet didn't know it, make a rhyme every time. But I'm not going to be able to show you every single aspect of how this technique works because it's too in-depth. That's why it takes 15 weeks to teach it. But just so you have an idea of some of the things that we're going to be teaching on this course and to get a sneak peek at how it all works. So I'll see you in the astrological software. So there are conflicting reports as to when Hendrix actually made that fated flight to London, which then began to put him more in the public eye and give him exposure, which ultimately led to the Jimi Hendrix Experience being created. Some people say it was the 24th of September. Some people say it was the 21st. Either of these dates fits with this. And in Hendrix's instance, this happened during Mercury, Saturn, Moon Dasha. Okay, so as you notice, you'll see these blue numbers here in the chart. Those are house cusps. I do a lot of work with house cusps. Also on this course, you'll learn how to accurately work with these as well. But Mercury is the 10th equal house lord in this particular instance. And there's a concept from Jimi Astrology, which basically amounts to the fact that when Mercury is in decent dignity and it's interacting with a factor that relates to a particular thing that you're trying to predict, and the way that it would influence it in this particular instance and the way that we're working with it would be through Rashi aspect, then Mercury has the capacity to manifest that particular thing. It's something called Jaimini's second source of strength. And Mercury manifests through using his skill, or through using his dexterity, or through using communication, all of those particular things. But when Mercury is not neutral, dignity, or above, like neutral, friend, great friend, own house, mula trikona, or exalted, when Mercury is not one of those things, rather than being able to manifest that particular thing, he instead often has the potential to frustrate that very same thing. Now, Mercury equally has the potential to create career success due to the fact that he rules the 10th, and he's in a condition that's called Bala, and I'll explain that for a moment. When planets are Bala, they can be productive in creating things, but they need assistance because Bala means infant. And just like if you send a baby to do a job, it's going to need some instruction. Bala planets tend to work the same way. So initially looking at this, we'd be going, how did Hendrix ever have his big break during this particular period of time? And we're going to find out here in a specific moment. So Mercury's Rashi aspecting his own house. Well, he's creating frustration in terms of trying to bring success. Saturn is also a natural indicator for career. And it is for everybody in everybody's horoscope. And so Mercury is Rashi aspecting Saturn. In addition to that, Mercury is bringing frustration in trying to manifest career through Saturn as well. So why is Saturn a karaka for career? Well, because we need to have discipline and we need to have the capacity to stick with something long enough in order to be successful, in order to succeed. Okay? So in short, Mercury seems to only be bringing frustration to the situation. But what we're going to do is we're going to bring up our mutual agenda chart. And I have also created a Word document for us to help to kind of illustrate a lot of these points. So we'll do that now. Our Rashi chart is here. Here, I'll tell you what, I'll put it right here in this middle chart screen. Okay, here's our Rashi chart. So when we go through and we look at Mercury, the important thing to remember is that because Mercury's Bala, regardless of the fact that he's in an enemy's house, because of the fact that he's Bala, and equally because he's in a condition that's called Swapna, Mercury stands the potential to be able to create something if he has assistance. So we need to go through and look at all of those different things that Mercury is connected with. In short, what does Mercury have an agenda for? Okay, so if we look at the top row here, it'll give us a clue as to what all these different things are. So Mercury is the 7th cusp lord, here as we see in the Rashi chart. So it has an agenda for that. It also rules Saturn, which is the 2nd cusp lord. So it has an agenda for that. Mercury is the 7th equal house lord as well as the 10th equal house lord. So he has an agenda for the 7th and 10th houses. And he rules Saturn, who is the 2nd and 3rd equal house lord. And here we see that he disposits Saturn. Saturn's also the karaka for career, so that's important. Okay? And this is happening during Mercury-Saturn. That's an important thing. When you see a Antardasha, or even another dasha period where the planet that's just above that dasha lord is the ruler of the other one, that's an important factor. For instance, Mercury-Saturn. Well, Mercury rules Saturn. So that can be an important period of time in the individual's life. Those are little things we like to look out for. But we also want to look at what Mercury rules from the Atmakarika, which is the moon, because that's also a career factor. Well, Mercury is the 12th Rashi Lord from the moon, okay, as well as the 3rd Rashi Lord from the moon. So we also have the 12th house involved, as well as the 3rd house, which we already have, okay? Mercury also rules Saturn, which is the 7th Rashi Lord from the moon and the 8th Rashi Lord from the moon. So in short, through the Atmakarika, Mercury has a 3rd, 12th, 7th, and 8th agenda. We also want to look at Mercury's responsibilities from Saturn, who's the natural Karaka for career. Saturn, well, Mercury is the 1st Rashi Lord from Saturn, and equally the 4th Rashi Lord from Saturn, as well as due to the fact that Mercury rules Saturn. Saturn is the 8th Rashi Lord from himself, the 8th equal house Lord, and the 9th equal house Lord from himself. So Mercury has an agenda through Saturn for the 1st, the 4th, the 8th, and the 9th. So when I bring up my Word document, we'll see all of these things, okay? So we can see Mercury has a 2nd, a 7th, a 10th, a 3rd, a 12th, and an 8th, and it disposits Saturn. This is interesting. You know, Hendrix's big break was through a friend of his. That's how he, basically, that's how word got to Chas Chandler, because he had a friend who was equally a friend with Chas Chandler, and she recommended that Chas Chandler come down and see him at a club in Greenwich Village. Okay, so here we see the 2nd house, which relates to friends. Here we also see the 3rd house, which relates to associates. In order for this to take place, Hendrix had to travel abroad. The 3rd house relates to travel. 12th house is foreign countries, but also so is the 7th, right? And it was through somebody else's resources that Hendrix was able to come into a contract. So here we see all those factors being highlighted here. But what about this enemy sign? What about Mercury ruling an enemy sign? We should see some frustration there. Well, Hendrix was already in his Mercury Dasha for a while, and basically when Hendrix went to play in New York City for a while, it was difficult for him because he didn't fit into the Greenwich village music scene, which was primarily like, pop music and things like that, due to being African American and due to being too popish for the African American blues and soul scene. He didn't fit in with the music scene in Harlem. So it was particularly frustrating for him in New York City, and it was seemingly difficult for him to get the level of attention that he, would have wanted in order to be able to break it into the music business. Let's take a look and see how this plays out a little bit further, right? So I'm going to move this over here, and I'll go back and forth between highlighting it and doing away with it, okay? So we also want to see what is shared between Mercury and Saturn. Let's move it down here. So when we look at that, Saturn rules the 2nd cusp lord. Or sorry, Saturn is the 2nd cusp lord, I meant to say. So Mercury and Saturn both have a 2nd house agenda. Okay? When we look at that, Saturn is the 2nd and the 3rd equal house lord. So Saturn also has a 3rd house agenda, just like Mercury. Okay? And we could almost stop there, but we're not going to stop there. Okay, so it's down at the bottom of the screen if you're looking for the Word document. We also have to look, if you remember, from the Atmakarika. Well, Saturn rules the 7th and the 8th from the moon. So we have the 7th, which Mercury also has, and the 8th, which Mercury also has. Okay? So also, when we're looking at this, Saturn rules the 8th and the 9th from himself. So we also have the 8th, which they share, But Mercury doesn't have a ninth house agenda, so we're going to discount that for the time being. So how did we get this 10th house agenda? Well, Saturn's an indicator for career, so it naturally has a 10th house agenda. So we see that the 2nd, the 3rd, the 7th, the 8th, and the 10th are shared between Mercury and Saturn. So what are these other numbers about over here? When we go through this technique, it's important to look for what Saturn rules from Mercury and what Mercury rules from Saturn. Not what position they're placed in, but instead what they rule from each other. Okay, it's because we're looking at Mercury, Saturn. So in terms of that, Saturn rules the 2nd and the 3rd from Mercury, which we can see here. And Mercury rules the 1st and the 4th from Saturn. This will give us some additional ideas in terms of how this event is likely to play itself out. Well, it's likely going to happen through some extra responsibilities that come upon him. When you see the 3rd and the 4th house coming together, that generally involves a move of home. Okay, 1st and 2nd together is a matter of self-esteem. But in addition to that, if we remember, 2nd house is friends, 3rd house is associates, and 4th house is home. So there was a change in home environment for this to happen. Okay, so we've looked at Mercury, Saturn. This happened during Mercury, Saturn, Moon. So we need to go down further and look at this. But let's look at some other interesting factors first. Mercury's the Darakaraka here. It's a relationship factor. Well, this happened to him through a relationship. That's what helped him with his big break, a relationship. Okay. Saturn's the Matrikaraka, which can also be an indicator of home. So it happened equally through a shift of home. Now, when we get to the moon's the Atmakaraka, which is the career indicator. Okay. So this is what gave him his big break. When we look at this moon, and we need to look at Saturn because we didn't do that yet, did we? Saturn is Kumara. Because Saturn is Kumara, it's youthful. Youthful planets are able to be productive. They can create things, okay? Unless they're debilitated. That's a different story. So these are some of the nuances that you're going to need to learn on the course if you take the course, okay? So Saturn's neutral and it's Kumara, okay? So we won't look at all the other subtleties that could be there, like, some difficulties eventually with the relationship and things along those lines, which were factors that equally would have shown into the equation. But we'll just look at it simply in terms of the agenda that's shared. Now, when we get to the moon's in its own house. When a planet's in its own house, Mula Trikona or exalted, it's Jagrat, which means it's awake. That makes it a strong and solid planet. Okay, so the moon can equally produce something and help Mercury to produce something and help Saturn to produce something due to its strength, okay, through being Jagrat. Okay, so we want to see what Mercury and basically Saturn and the moon all share as an agenda. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so when it comes to the moon, here we'll see that there are some additional agendas. So we're seeing a 2nd house agenda. How does this 2nd house agenda come into being? Okay, so we need to figure that out. Well, the moon is the 2nd Rashi Lord from Saturn. So here we see the 2nd house coming into being. Okay, we equally can see that the moon has an agenda for the 8th, which if you look here, that's shared with Saturn as well. Okay, the moon has an agenda for the 4th as well. So that's shared with Saturn. Why is that shared with Saturn? Well, you might say it's because of that, but there's another reason. Because of something called Bhavat Bhavam, which is also something I will be teaching on this course for those of you who don't know it. But Bhavat Bhavam basically relates to the concept that the house from a house can produce the same thing as the initial house. What's he saying here? Okay, so let's explain that. So if we're looking at the 4th house, what that means is that the 4th from the fourth can equally create fourth house results. Okay, so the seventh is the fourth from the fourth. So the seventh can create fourth house results, especially when it's coming into contact with another fourth house factor, as in this particular instance. Okay, so basically the seventh equates to the fourth with Saturn also. So they share that agenda. The moon's the Atmakaraka. That gives it a 10th house agenda. It's interesting too because the moon, as we see, disposits Jupiter, which is the Amachakaraka, which is an indicator of friends. So this happened again through a friend, as we were talking about. Okay, so let's look at what the moon rules from Saturn. Well, it rules the second, which again points in the direction of a friend. Okay, and Saturn rules the sixth and the seventh from the moon. So Saturn is going to produce, because of Saturn's dignity, a little bit of both, a little bit of sixth house results and a little bit of seventh house results. So there may have been some problems within his relationship due to some of these things that were coming to the surface. But Saturn equally, brought public, recognition through the seventh house, which is another factor that would be associated with it. When the fourth and the seventh come together, that relates to living abroad. So here we see that coming into creation. When the 10th and the 7th come together, it can also equate to working abroad. So we would have seen that coming into creation. So in short, all three of these planets share this agenda. And there's the strength between those three planets to create that particular factor. Okay? But because of Mercury being weak, that means that later on down the line in Mercury Dasha, there can be some problems that may happen if some other subperiods come along that can create problems, because the rest of the planets can only go as high as the Mahadasha Lord. But we're not going to go too deeply into that. I just wanted to give you a taster of these techniques so you'd have an idea of what this was all about. Okay, so here we see an indication of how when planets share the same agenda for something in a specific period of life, that it can make that event come to pass. So this is what I'm going to teach on the first installment of what's actually likely going to be a 3-part webinar series. What do I mean by that? Well, this first part of the webinar is 15 weeks long. Next year, I'm going to teach you how to narrow this window of prediction down even further, because as you see, we're looking at a 3-month period of time. We need to know how to narrow it down further. We've got a rectified birth time here. We could go down further to the rest of the dashas if we wanted to. But when we don't have a rectified birth time, we need to know other ways to do that. And good ways to do that are through using a couple of Jimi dashas, which is something I'll teach in the part 2 of the course next year sometime. And then when we have that narrowed down, often to within like a couple of weeks, we want to find the transit that creates it. And that's something I'll teach in the 3rd part, which will either be late 2019 or early 2020. So if you want to hop on for this particular installment of the webinar course, you can do so through going to my website at the link which will be shown above. The course is $329 for 15 classes. That basically amounts to about $20 per class, which isn't a lot for a course, so to speak. So I do hope you'll join us. It starts this Sunday at 8 p.m. London time. And if you wish to join, please follow the link above. Thanks a lot. Bye now.